Hey, everybody. I'm here with Kimberly Holmes. Kimberly is the CEO of marriagehelper.com. And Marriage Helper is an amazing website similar to the Growth Marriage. Like, we are just advocates for marriage. We want to help as many people have incredible relationships as possible. Um, the Marriage Helper website is built off of Dr. Joe Beam's marriage research. He's done, I don't know how many years, you can tell me, Kimberly, but several, probably over a decade, more than that, of marriage research. And their goal is to figure out what it is that really goes into making a relationship work over the long term and how you can save your relationship if it's on the brink in many cases. So I'm actually really excited to talk to Kimberly today and pick her brain and figure out more about some of the research that they base their theories on, and some of the strategies that they use to help couples in crisis, specifically when it comes to the topic of affairs. But we'll get into that in just a minute. Welcome to the show, Kimberly.
Thank you for having me, Nate. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. I always love talking to a fellow marriage nerd.
I know, right? I was looking through all of your social media and YouTube stuff before hopping on and just in preparation for this, and I thought we like a lot of the same people.
Yeah,
Like we we would probably geek out on a ton of marriage stuff that the
yeah,
audience would even get bored at some point. They'd be like,
maybe.
"Yeah."
I At some point I want to just get some of my fellow marriage nerd friends together for like a weekend retreat and just sit
Right?
around and geek out and talk about ways to make the world a better place. So
Hey, I
you're going
love
to be
it.
on that short list.
I would love it. Yeah, that would be the party to get the invite to. I'm all for it.
We need to do it while I'm living in Costa Rica right now, and so we need to do it
Stop it.
while I can get everybody to come to this tropical location.
Everyone in my life, I feel like, has been talking about Costa Rica. You're
Mm,
probably okay, so it's not really everyone. You're like number 6 or 7.
cool.
But I really wanna go there this year. That was actually on my, like, vision list for the year.
Come. Let's hang out after we end this call, and I'll tell
Yeah,
you some of the
I'm
stuff that
Costa
we've
Rica.
learned and experienced.
Was great.
Okay, well, we're not here to talk about Costa Rica. We're here to talk about something way more important, and it's something that makes me a little nervous to talk about because it's the word that we all promise to avoid the day that we get married. It's the D word, divorce. Well, not divorce, but the thing that often leads to divorce is the affair. I don't think anybody gets married and thinks, you know what, one day I hope I have an affair.
Right.
um,
Most
so
people don't think.
no, I don't think anybody really thinks that. So my first question for you is, what are some of the common misconceptions that people have? Do you hear that horn honking?
Yeah, I heard it stop though.
That's Costa Rica. Okay.
Fun.
So the question I want to start off with is, what are some of the popular misconceptions that people have about why people have affairs?
Hmm. Some common misconceptions. Yeah, that's a great one. You know, a lot of times when we put some of the stuff about affairs, because a lot of the content we put out at Marriage Helper does evolve around that, cheating, affairs, different things. And a lot of the responses we'll see in the comments are of people saying, if someone's cheated on you, you can never trust them
Leave.
again. Once a
Right.
cheater, always cheater. Leave, just get to be happy, all of the things. And while there is to some extent the right for the person who's been cheated on to make the decision to leave the relationship, there's also a lot of benefit to actually working to save the marriage and put it back on track because the majority of the time, affairs, like you said before, they're not pre planned. It's actually not that you are married to a bad person who's done bad things. It's that you are married to a good person who, because of either being in a place that they shouldn't have been, kind of a wrong place, wrong time thing, or that there were other circumstances in their life that kind of led to this being something that happened, that's more so why affairs happen. And so we can get into, you know, the different types of affairs that there are, because there's actually 3 different types of affairs, and it matters which one has happened as to what your next step should be. Or we can even talk about what's going on in a person's mind when they have an affair, because that's something that people are typically interested in as well when they are the ones who have been cheated on or are currently being cheated on.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I want to talk about both those things. I want to talk about the three different types of affairs and what are going on in people's minds. But I want to hammer home something interesting that I think you just pointed out. Sounds to me like one of the fallacies that we have about people who do engage in affairs is we I don't know how to put this specifically, but we have a fundamental attribution error. Are you familiar with that term?
Mhm.
The idea behind, for those of you who are not psychology nerds, the idea behind fundamental attribution error is when I do something wrong, it's because of my circumstances. Like if somebody, if I cut somebody off in traffic, it's because I'm really busy or because I'm in a big hurry and I'm not a bad person, but I got locked out and I had to make a kind of a quick turn and oops, I'm not always this way. It was just an accident. But when somebody cuts you off on the freeway and you're driving, they're an a-hole, they're a bad person, they're selfish, they're reckless, and it's a character assassination. So when I do something bad, it's because of circumstances, but when you do something bad, it's because there's a flaw in your character. And so I think probably from the perspective of people who have engaged in affairs, they might think like, oh, wrong place, wrong time. It was just a circumstantial thing. Like this doesn't reflect on who I am, but their partner might perceive it as you're a terrible person. You have no ethics, no values, and you're once a cheater, always a cheater. So
Mhm.
I think that's an interesting thing to point out that maybe the frame through which or the lens that we see our partner through when they do engage in an affair could be inaccurate a little.
Mhm. Very much so. The other interesting thing is when you actually start to look at the research of how prevalent affairs are in marriage, it is difficult to come out with a really grounded outcome of that. And the reason is because, as I'm sure you're aware of, that people don't always tell the truth, even in research. Even when they're behind their own computer in the privacy of their home, they still could fudge the numbers. And so there's a lot of different studies that have been out there, one of which Marriage Helper actually partnered with a research group this past year, Barna Research Group, to conduct. And what we found is that 33% of relationships are affected by an affair at some point. So that's about one out of three.
Wow. Yeah.
But then there was a study done, I believe by McKinsey. This was several years ago and it was more longitudinal. And it was 50, right about 50%. So we're looking at somewhere between 30 to 50% of marriages at some point will be affected by an affair,
Okay.
which that's not to scare people.
No, don't scare people.
Not to scare people.
So I want to know what is defined as an affair because I
Mm,
think I've had lots of conversations with couples, and I think we all think in our mind what we know. We have a definition of what an affair is, what cheating is, but
mhm,
I've found that oftentimes couples don't realize that they don't have the same thing in their head when they're talking about this word affair. And then one person can engage in a behavior and the other person says, "You're cheating on me." And it's like, I had no idea that that was your limit. For example, like just to clarify, um, like maybe one person in the partnership thinks pornography is having an affair and the other
mhm,
person doesn't. Or maybe one person in the marriage thinks, having going to dinner one-on-one with somebody of the opposite sex is a form of cheating, and the other person sees it as like a business lunch. And so we all have kind of different boundaries that I
mhm.
think we don't necessarily always acknowledge or understand until that boundary's been crossed. And so I'm wondering if there's a specific definition that you have of what an affair is based off of the research that we can all kind of agree upon for the rest of this conversation.
Great. Typically, so let me start by saying that there's a lot of instances where people feel like they have been cheated on because a breach of trust has occurred.
Okay.
So you see these new terms kind of coming up like financial infidelity. I would not classify that under affair. I do believe that if there's been a breach of trust that is that has been broken, then that's a problem and it needs to be talked about, but it's not all the same as an affair. So like same as pornography. I do not believe that's healthy for a marriage. Um, it can, and that's one of the ones that can kind of be on the line. But here's the definition that we use for has a marriage been affected by an affair? Either one person in the relationship, at least one person in the relationship, has either physically, emotionally, or both entered into the depth of a relationship with another person that should only be done with their spouse.
Mm.
So there is physical affair, which could be mostly purely sexual. And I think we can all agree with that. Um, And even then, like, you could say, well, where does that start? Does it start with hand holding or does it go all the way to intercourse? Um, Probably right when the person is engaging with something intimate with another person that really should only be reserved for their spouse. That's
Yeah.
when you've begun to cross a physical line. But then there are emotional affairs where there may never be any physical touch. But if you are relying on that person to fill an emotional void within you and becoming attached to that person emotionally so that that person is now in line as important to you as the relationship with your spouse is, and you can't let them go, that is an emotional affair.
I love that. A boundary that my wife and I have set to kind of, I feel like encapsulates this idea is that we never engage in any behavior or conversation that were the other person to magically show up. Like if my wife just magically showed up next to the table while I was at a business lunch or something, that I would have to change my behavior or hide it or feel ashamed. So,
Right.
physical touch, I can hug a colleague because if my wife was standing next to me, I would still do that same thing, or I would still crack jokes with a colleague, or a friend or a family member or whatever. But I never crossed that line where if my wife was present, it would make anybody feel uncomfortable.
Mhm. I That's beautiful, and I wish every marriage would have similar boundaries. And
Yeah.
another way that people can think about it too is, did something happen that I am ashamed to tell my spouse and I wanna hide it?
Yeah.
Because that's another way you can begin asking yourself if, if the listeners were the ones who are engaging in the behavior, then you can begin to ask yourself, am I beginning to cross lines that I shouldn't
Yeah.
cross?
That reminds me of Shirley Glass's work about putting up
Mm.
walls between you and your partner. And
Mhm.
how when you start to put a wall between you and your partner, you isolate yourself from them. You don't get an accurate view into each other's world. And the first step to kind of healing after an affair or something that even alludes to an affair is to create a window in that wall that you've put up and try and recreate that connection and that honesty and communication.
Right,
Yeah, that's
right.
huge. Okay, so now we've kind of established the ground rule. What is an affair? Can we talk a little bit about? You said there's three types of affairs. What do those look like?
Yes. Yes. So we can break them down into three different categories. The first is what we call the short-lived affair. And that is what you would typically call a one night stand. So that is more of, maybe a guy went to a bar with his friends one night, got super drunk, and ended up making decisions that are never justified. None of these are ever justified.
Right.
We're simply explaining how they can happen. And it really was a one-time thing that he regrets, inexplicably regrets. But it happened and it still would classify as an affair.
Yeah.
So that's what the short-lived affair. It's really a one-time thing. They're mostly primarily sexual. The second one is the allowed affair. So this is happening more and more in society where the open marriages are happening, the swinging, wife swap thing, whatever you would call it, to where both parties are going into it saying, yeah, let's try this. It's allowed, so to say.
Mm,
But what we are seeing from our experience and research with couples is that the majority of the time, those allowed affairs will turn into an emotional affair, which is the next one I'll talk about, and it ends up splitting a marriage apart. So there's a lot of interesting research out there. And even if you read some of Gottman's work, he doesn't necessarily say to be completely monogamous, although that is the line that I follow. But he does say you should talk about it because it is
yeah.
highly risky behavior.
Consensual
Highly
monogamy, I think is the term, right?
consensual non-monogamy. Yes, that would be the term. It's high risk because there you are opening the door to become unfulfilled in your current marriage and want other things. The grass is not always greener on the other
Yeah.
side. I remember we had a woman call into us. This was a couple of years ago now, where this was what had happened to them. Her and her husband entered into an open marriage. He he ended up falling in love with the other wife that they were in the relationship with, and now she was coming to us saying, "What can I do to try and get him back? This wasn't the plan. It wasn't supposed to happen this way." So, still a type of affair, but you know about it, but it can be difficult to deal with when it turns into number 3, which is the emotional affair.
Mm.
Now, this one is where it starts to get really interesting when we look at the research. So, are you familiar with Dr. Dorothy Tinov or Dr. Helen Fisher? You might be more
Hel-
familiar with them.
Helen Fisher, yes.
Okay. So, back in the 1970s, Dr. Dorothy Tinov started studying people and what caused them to fall madly in love with someone else. And what she found was that there's actually things that start happening in a person's brain when they start to fall madly in love with another person. And she coined the term to describe this process as limerence.
Yeah.
And so limerence, Limerenc, Dr. Helen Fisher has since taken over that work and she's done even more in the field. But what we see is that it typically happens. It doesn't have to happen at the beginning of every relationship, but it does typically happen. And it is aided by there's 13 kind of characteristics that someone is going through when they're in limerence with another person. And a lot of them are actually paralleled. They actually look a lot like what it looks like to be in the middle of an addiction because the serotonin and dopamine levels are mimicking that of a person who is an addict. Limerence is not an addiction, but what it does in your brain and in your body is similar to where it leads you to want to continue chasing a high that another person is giving you. And so you tend to spend 85% of your waking hours thinking about this other person. You can't see any flaw in this other person, only good things, so on and so forth. It sounds a lot like the beginning of dating relationships that many of us have had. Like that's definitely how I felt about my husband when we started dating. Limerence, though, always ends because it's more of a biological way to connect with another person in order for that connection to be replaced by a long term committed relationship. So the problem happens when a married person enters into limerence with someone that they should not be in limerence in, like someone other than their spouse. Because then at that point, they start saying things like, I've never felt this way about anyone else. And then they'll start looking at their spouse and saying, I love you, but I'm not in love with you anymore. And they're being completely clouded by this emotional connection, this limerence that they have developed towards a person who is not their spouse. And that is a harder, so you can see why you would deal with that one differently than the first two, the short-lived or the allowed, because now you're trying to break someone of a high that they're wanting to continually chase. And it'll run its course in time. But the question is, how long is the standing spouse? That's what we call them, the person trying to save marriage. How long are they going to wait around for that other person to end the affair and break the limerence and come back around? So it's really fascinating.
That is fascinating. I mean, so you've got these three different types of of uh of affairs. They're distinctly different from each other. And so I think it's really important when you do, if you're one of those 30 to 50% of couples who does encounter this at some point in your relationship, not all affairs are treated equal or created
Right.
equal. So they shouldn't be treated equal.
Right.
I guess that's what I should say.
Right.
Um, so you posed another question, and I want to pursue that line of questioning because I think it's really interesting. I think the second question that you posed was, why do people engage in affairs?
So we won't talk more about the short-lived because it's more matter of circumstance.
Yeah.
The allowed affair, a lot of times people will enter into that one because they feel like they're missing something currently in the relationship that they have. And so they enter into that as a way to either spice up their intimacy or fill that hole that really would be better served filled by working on rebuilding the intimacy between the two of them. But sometimes they go into the allowed affair. But the emotional affair will typically happen for either really one of two reasons. Either number one, there's a person who has not put their guards up. They've not put those boundaries in place like you said you have with your wife, right? I have similar ones with my husband. So they've not put those in place and then they start getting close to another person. A lot of times this happens at work.
Mhm.
So maybe it is just two people who work on the same team or they work in the same office, but you start spending more time with this person. And because you're around them more, you have shared interests, you start talking to them, opening up to them. And just over time, you don't realize it's happening, but you begin to develop feelings for this person. And as I'm sure you know, the more you self-reveal to another person and they accept you for what you're revealing, you will grow an attachment. You can begin to grow an attachment to that person. And so after it really kind of feels to the spouse this is happening too, like you don't know what happened because everything was fine at home. But then all of a sudden your spouse comes home one day and says, I don't love you anymore. I want to go be with this other person. And you're thinking, what did I do? It may not have been anything you did. It may have simply been that boundaries and walls weren't set up within your spouse to stop that from happening. Another way that affairs can happen could be because there is dissatisfaction in the marriage. And if it's not being worked through or worked on, then it can kind of lead to a breeding ground within a person to look elsewhere. They might be more inclined. They may not consciously realize they're doing it, but they're looking for someone to listen to them, someone to laugh at their jokes, someone to support them. And when they find a person, again, most of the time it's not intentional, but when they find this other person who reacts to them in the way that they're longing for their spouse to react to them, then that is another breeding ground for affairs to start. Again, they're never justified, not justifying in anything I'm saying for why affairs happen, but simply trying to explain the context around how they can occur.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder, I'd be interested to know how often affairs they do sneak up on you, are
Mm,
unintended, and how often they're intentional. Somebody actually
mm.
going out and looking for something. Um, I don't know if that research exists, but that would be an interesting thing to figure out. So,
It is a good one. I might submit it to my research team. I'm going to write it down. Actually, it's a good idea.
um, yeah. So there's a lot of things that everything you're talking about is reminding me of the book "The State of Affairs" by Esther Perel. Uh,
Hmm.
Such a fascinating book. When I read that book, I was like, wow. I gained a lot of compassion for people
Hmm.
experiencing affairs on both sides. Um, I'd actually like to talk about. Let's talk a little bit more about the person who might be engaging in the affair.
Hmm.
So, if they find themselves in a position where they are unexpectedly, or maybe let's go with the unexpected situation.
Hmm.
So, let's say you've got somebody who's unexpectedly developed feelings for a coworker, as you kind of proposed a minute ago. What do you say? What does that person do when they realize they're getting more and more attached? Maybe things have escalated a little bit physically as well, or maybe a lot physically. And
Hmm.
they're in this real conundrum because they're married to one person, but they're feeling attached and connected to another. What's the appropriate plan of action? What are they supposed to do?
Yeah. Well, before I answer that question, typically I'll explain how typically that person feels and kind of what they're thinking through it.
Yeah.
So it typically will start as, I'm just going to go have lunch with this person. It's no big deal. I probably shouldn't tell my spouse that I just met with them again. You know, I don't think it's that big of a deal, but we're just going to start meeting privately because people are starting to talk and are kind of starting to look at us a little strange, but we know we're just friends. But we just don't want we don't want to get the looks. We don't want to get the chatter. So we're just going to start meeting privately. And that's how it begins. It's this
Rationalizing.
lots of rationalizing. It's not a big deal. I'm not doing anything wrong. I'll be fine. And what's happening in that process is you don't realize that you're letting down your walls and you're not putting up any boundaries to protect yourself
Right.
because it feels good. You rationalize because you like the way this other person is making you feel. And then it'll finally get to a point where some boundary will be crossed, some personal kind of mental boundary will be crossed. Either maybe you kiss or there's something else physical or just emotionally the person becomes your best friend and that's kind of when all of it shifts and the person will begin to feel more of this limerent state of like a rush of endorphins. This is the person I'm supposed to be with. And then it's not just rationalizing, it's justifying to where, you know what? I never was happy in my marriage. And these are all of the negative things. They actually the spouse having the affair will start vilifying their current spouse,
Mm.
only seeing their bad qualities and only able to see what's called the limerent object, only able to see the LO's good qualities. So it creates this halo effect around this new affair relationship. And so then that person has now entered into a state where actually mentally they aren't like themselves. They're not thinking the way that they used to. A lot of times people will say, when they reflect back on currently being in this state, they say, I became a person I didn't know anymore. Like I wasn't making the same decisions I would typically make. And so they end up making sometimes big decisions to either move out of their house, go live with this other person, or start a divorce process, all while they're kind of faced by this cloud of limerence and these feelings for another person.
Yeah,
And
they're
so,
intoxicated.
yeah, yes, they're intoxicated. And it's similar to thinking about a person being under anesthesia, how they'll always say at that point, don't make any major life decisions because you're not thinking straight. But that's exactly what these people in limerence are doing. They don't have correct judgment, but they're making huge life decisions. And it's difficult. Here's what can make it frustrating, that it's really difficult to break that relationship up unless, well, let me say it this way. It to some extent, it kind of has to run its course. I'll come back to a caveat on that, but the person who is in limerence is gonna be so protective of that relationship that any person who tries to come between them and that other person is now the enemy.
Mm.
So, if the spouse trying to save the marriage tries to say, "You have to choose me or her, me or him now, like, make the decision, it's an ultimatum," that's typically the worst thing you could do because the person is gonna see you, the spouse, as the enemy and only wanna be with them. So then a lot of listeners may be thinking, "Well, then what do I do? If what can I do
Yeah.
in that sense?" Um, well, if you're the spouse wanting to save the marriage, we'll probably get to that one in just a minute, but let's stick with the one we're in now. The person who's in the affair, so what should they have done along the way? Well, they should have noticed some of the red flags at first and took the power away of the secret of the relationship and shared what was going on with their spouse. That's how you stop limerence from happening. You have healthy communication with your spouse. You have the trust built in to where you can tell them anything. And the marriage needs to be a marriage. Like this is me and my husband. I have several times over our 11 years of marriage gone to my husband and said, I have to tell you about this lunch meeting I just went to. And I think something inappropriate was said. Like, I will go to him and tell him. Or if I start feeling like I'm attracted to someone else, I immediately tell my husband because we have built that in our marriage. He doesn't berate me or attack me or make me feel bad when I share that with him. He appreciates that I'm being open with him because we both understand just because we're married doesn't mean we stop being attracted to other people.
Mm.
It's what we do with those feelings of attraction that make the next difference. So that's what you should do
Yeah.
if you're in the middle of that. But there will come a point where limerence kind of goes through phases, and there will come a point where a person in limerence it starts to wear off and they begin to see the consequences of their actions. And so the next thing a person could do at that point, the person in the affair, is number one, if their spouse doesn't know, to confess it to their spouse, but then also to begin separating from the limerent object and committing to refocus on their marriage.
Mm.
So those are the ways that person in an affair can handle it.
So that can be a big ask.
Mhm.
Sharing something that you're deeply, deeply ashamed of that you know will hurt somebody that you love is one
Yeah.
huge ask. And then um, parting ways or disconnecting yourself from somebody that you feel an intense attachment to is also, I know, a real difficult thing for a lot of people. You know, I'm thinking of people in my life right now who've been through this, and I know it's not pleasant or easy or fun. It just
Mhm.
it's sickening. Like
Mhm.
it sickens them probably that they let it happen, and also that they have to do these things that are so painful and difficult. So,
Yes. They really do go through a grief process
yeah.
because this was an important person and an important relationship to them, and they're going to grieve it. And then there's also this sense of shame, right? Like, can my can my wife forgive me? Can my husband forgive me? Can I forgive me?
Yeah.
And sometimes people even a lot of people we've worked with have said, honestly, at this point, I just feel like I've done so much damage that maybe it's better for me to just start over with someone new.
Yeah.
To which we encourage them and say, but forgiveness is what's so powerful. Like when we look at the research on how to heal after an affair or any breach of trust in a marriage, it's the forgiveness that not only heals the person who's done it, but also the person who's been offended and can ultimately lead the marriage to be stronger than it was even ever before the affair or the breach of trust happened.
Yeah.
So there's definitely reason to try and stick it through and make the marriage work.
Yeah, and I love what, I think it's Harriet Lerner says about she's written a lot on forgiveness, and one of the things that I remember from one of her books on forgiveness was encouraging people to remember or realize that you don't have to forgive somebody 100%. You can forgive them 80% or 90%, and it doesn't have to be like, "I forgive you for every single thing that you did, and I let it go."
Mm,
Uh, you can maybe forgive them for 80% of what they did and then still work through that 20%, but let go of a big chunk of it. It's not like an all or nothing thing. I don't know if I did a good
mhm.
job communicating that or not, but anyway,
Yeah.
I love the
Well,
concept of, yeah,
mhm. The yes. So I think the other thing that trips people up about forgiveness, and especially in thinking, let's keep about affairs because that's one that people are typically like, I would never forgive someone for doing that to me.
right.
But the you may not feel the forgiveness before you make the decision to forgive. But
Yes.
it's making the decision that I'm not going to hold this over
Yeah.
the other person and I'm not going to let it continue to take up my thoughts, I'm going to choose to forgive and let this go even though I'm not going to forget.
Right.
And it still takes time to work through the continued emotions that you feel
Right.
even if you make the decision to forgive.
Yeah. It doesn't mean you endorse their behavior. It doesn't mean
Right.
you open yourself up to being hurt like that again. It doesn't
Right.
you forget. It doesn't mean that, you just pretend it never happened.
Mhm.
But it does mean that you stop holding it over their head and you stop letting it consume your life. I love that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Like you said. Okay, so let's flip the script a little bit. What about the betrayed partner, the person who has been affaired? What I just turned that into a verb. That's now a verb. What
Hey, coin it. It'll be it'll be the next big thing.
what advice do you have for that person? Their partner comes forward and discloses an affair, or they catch their partner in the midst of an affair, and it feels like their world is falling down around them. They're like, "What the heck? I thought I
Mhm.
knew this person. They're a complete stranger to me." And it's that chaos, that grief, that feeling of not having a sure foundation at all. What do you say to a person in that position? What do they do?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say to that person is, "I'm so sorry this has happened," because it does feel like your world is completely upheavaled, and you're gonna be questioning what's true. Like, what else are they lying about? What else has happened I don't know about? Has my marriage even been worth it? And so your anxiety is high. There's a lot going on, but you're not alone. There have been thousands upon thousands of other people who have gone through this, and it's going to be okay. It doesn't feel okay right now, and that's normal. But in the end, you are going to be okay no matter what happens. And then from there, really what helps people more than anything is understanding why. Why is this happening? So even what we've already talked about up until now, that understanding of limerence or the short-lived affair or whatever it is, that's where a lot of people will lean in and say, "That makes so much sense." Yes, like they are vilifying me and they are not seeing any flaws in this other person.
Yeah.
And that will start to just put light bulbs off and also help the person experiencing the betrayal not feel so crazy or like they have done something wrong. Because now it's all lining up, it's all beginning to make sense. So what's the next thing that you can do? The first thing that you can do is to begin working on yourself. And I realize that this might seem counter mindset to the situation, but right now, you can't control your spouse. You can't control who they're seeing, when they're seeing them, what they're doing when they're together. But what you can control is you. And here's the way that we like to talk about it. So a lot of people will want to cling more when they find out this is happening. Like they'll want to, we call them push behaviors. They'll want to try and push their spouse to make the decision to come back to them. So they'll plead, beg, whine, cry. Sometimes they'll even do the complete opposite of that, where they'll just completely ignore their spouse in hopes that their spouse will start paying, like they'll start missing them and come back, or they'll start unnecessary fights, or sometimes they'll start like breaking into their spouse's email or social media to spy on them and try and see what's going on. None of those things are going to work because it's all a focus illusion. You're focusing on what you feel like you can control, but you're not controlling it. The only thing you can control is you. So we encourage people to focus on becoming the best you can be physically, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually.
Mm.
Why? Here's why. Because uh, we think about how they do things in Australia. So this is a bit of an example. In Australia, there's so much land that when you have cows, you can't afford to put a fence around all of the land with all of the cows to keep them in. Instead, what you do is you build a well in the middle of the land because that is what's going to attract the cows to stay. So we encourage our clients, the people who follow Marriage Helper, to be the well. Be that person now that when your spouse comes out of this, when they finally come back to reality, they're going to see you're the better solution. You have been the one that not only was there before, but you're going to be there after. And you have done the work on yourself, first and foremost, for you to become the best you can be, first and foremost for you, not just to attract your spouse back, but because it's the best thing you can do for you. So we really encourage people to lean into that and then understand these other things. I mean, there's so many more things that people need to do, right? Like you do need to understand, well, how do you set boundaries? And if they're wanting to bring their affair partner around the kids, or if they're taking all the money, like there's definitely a lot more that we don't have the time to go into on this episode,
Yeah, yeah.
setting those boundaries and all of that. But what gives people the most calm that they can kind of grasp is, okay, I need to work on myself and I need to understand that this isn't because I have done something wrong, but I can begin creating our differences in our relationship. I can begin changing what I do in order to attract my spouse back
Mm.
from the affair.
I love that. It's like when everything feels like it's outside your control. There's an earthquake going on and you're caught in the middle of it, and
Mhm.
you're powerless to change what's going on. The only thing that you can do is focus on what you can control. That's the only thing that will give you power. And trying to change the uncontrollable, like in the middle of an earthquake, trying to stop the earth from shaking, is just going to get you frustrated and hurt. It's
Yeah.
it's gonna be discouraging and infuriating. It's trying to control
Yeah.
something you can't control is so discouraging. But when you look at the things you can control, like, am I exercising? Am I eating
Mm,
healthy? Am I
mm,
meditating? Am I spending time around people who love me and support me and see the good in me? Am I, pursuing hobbies that are of interest to me?
yeah.
Am I doing things that fill up my tank and make me feel good about myself, make me feel attractive and remind me of how interesting and talented I am? That's when you regain your self-confidence that might have been shattered in the middle of that betrayal,
Mhm.
that affair. And it's also what will help you stay grounded in the emotional turbulence of dealing with the fallout of an affair. And it makes your partner look at you not as
Right.
the crazy person that they can justify their bad
Exactly.
behavior on, but it makes them look at you and go, "Oh shoot, what was I thinking?
Exactly.
That was a bad decision on my part." And whether you choose to stay with them or not,
Mhm.
it's going to have the impact that I think ideally somebody who's been cheated on wants to have on their partner in that situation.
Yeah.
That was kind of dumb of me to do that. That was a big mistake. So just
Mhm.
love that. Brilliant. So,
Absolutely.
any other advice that you have, or anything else with regards to it? I know we could probably do a whole series if we wanted to on just affairs, and you've done a lot over on your YouTube channel on this topic.
Mm,
But just to wrap up this conversation, is there anything that comes to mind that you want to share with people who might be in the middle of this struggle and
mm,
looking for some hope or help?
mhm. There's actually a very high success rate of saving marriages when after an affair has happened. which if you were to just look at society, you would think absolutely not, because it seems like everyone just says once a cheater, always a cheater, don't trust them. But really, and even in the marriages that we've worked with, we see that about 70% success rate at saving marriages after an affair. It's actually, this might sound crazy, it's actually one of the easier marriage issues to work with.
Mm,
But when you start looking at control issues and different things like that is harder because it really has to do with deep behavioral change between two people, or at least one person in the marriage. Whereas an affair, like typically always the marriage is going to have to be worked on. But once the decision to end the affair has been made, then it really does leave the couple with the ability to rebuild a marriage that's stronger than ever. And so what I would encourage any listener who's going through this or knows someone who is that there really is hope.
yeah.
There really is hope. Your marriage doesn't have to end because of an affair. It really can be stronger than it ever was before. There is hope.
Yeah. And I think just to put a little bit more emphasis on that, stronger than it ever was before, people might be thinking like, how is that possible? And I just want you to think of anything difficult that you've ever been through together as a team. And
Mhm.
maybe it seemed insurmountable in the moment, or it was something that you'd never overcome before. And you were like, I don't know how we're going to get through this. And then you get through it. And on the other side, you go, dang, if we could get through that, we can get through anything. And if you can get through an affair, if you can successfully navigate the intricacies and the fallout and the grief and the betrayal and the restoration of trust after an affair, what can't you overcome? At that point, you're like, oh, well, bring it on. There's not a whole lot else. There are definitely things out there that are really difficult, but as far as marriage is concerned, that's right up there at the top of most brutal things that you can experience. And if you can successfully navigate that, I think you do kind of get that as a silent, secret badge of honor of, hey, uh, our marriage is indestructible. Like we've got this. So
You've got this.
I
That's right. Yes. Can I share a quick story?
would love that. Yeah. I love a good story.
Me too. It was probably probably 3 or 4, maybe 5 years ago now. We had a couple that we worked with. Their names are Jordan and Priscilla. And Priscilla had an affair and was ready to leave her husband. And so they actually came through one of our 3-day workshops. She did end up divorcing her husband and went to be with her affair partner. Ended up getting pregnant by her affair partner. And about 2 or 3 months after she got pregnant, she realized, I've made the biggest mistake of my life.
Mm,
And she had 5 other kids. She left her husband and her 5 kids. Like, that is how deep the limerence can be when we talk
yeah,
about making decisions you wouldn't normally. Like, moms don't leave their kids. Like,
no,
that doesn't happen. But Priscilla left and realized, I've made the biggest mistake. Now here she is, pregnant, away from her kids, away from her ex-husband. She calls Jordan and she tells him before he hears it from anyone else that she's pregnant. And when she was retelling this story, I'll never forget how she said it. Jordan, the husband at that time, didn't know if they were trying. So his response was, "Congratulations." And she said, "Well, do you want to hear my heart or do you just want to hear what happened?" And he said, "I want to hear your heart." And they talked for the next 2 to 3 hours where she opened up everything. And he said, "I will take you back. You and this baby, like, I will take you back." So she went back. They remarried. She had their 6th child, whose name is Molly. And now they're this beautiful family of 6. And Priscilla is now one of our coaches at Marriage Helper. It's helping people going through the same thing. And so that is the power of what I'm talking about when I say it can be saved and made stronger than ever. And here's what's even crazier. Her kids know what happened
mm,
because many of them were old enough, like they remember the divorce, they were there for the remarriage, and they know the power of them coming back together and they celebrate it. Like the kids are the ones going to school and saying, guess what? My parents remarried and now we have this new sister. And it's all because of forgiveness. And it's just so powerful the impact that can make on a family for generations to come.
that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that story. If
Yep.
people want to learn more about your program or what you do, where should they go?
marriagehelper.com. You can see we have a free mini course on there that we do on how to get your spouse back. We also have all of our other content and information, as well as going to youtube.com/marriagehelper, which you've referred to. We have a ton of videos there. And we have a podcast as well called Relationship Radio. So you can listen to that after you listen to the Growth Marriage podcast.
Thank you, Kimberly. It was a pleasure talking to you, and you're welcome back here anytime.
Thank you, Nate. I appreciate it so much.